Welcome, everyone, to the 30-minute Midas touch from beautiful Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welch WrestlePlex. Now, here is, pound for pound and inch for inch, the best of the best in professional wrestling today. A wrestling genius worth his weight in gold. The Golden Boy, Greg Anthony.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the latest edition of the 30-minute Midas Touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony, and with me, as always, is my co-host, the Mouth of the South, Mark Tipton.
Thank you. With all due respect to the great Jimmy Hart, one of the, as the owner of somewhere I haven't, We Hate School 45 somewhere, and I did have a cane, but I think I lost it over the years. A great admirer of Jimmy Hart. Having that name referenced to me is something I sincerely appreciate. And if we could today, well, really, on the 30-minute Midas Touch podcast, one of the things we've talked about with fondness is the era of wrestling territories. It's something that you've spoken about, and the importance of it, and it does have some benefits over the national format that we see generally in vogue today. And naturally, because of our geographic location, I think we both have a very soft spot in our heart for the Memphis wrestling territory. Would you like to just speak about Memphis in general right off the top before we get going?
Yeah, I mean, we're in Dyersburg, Tennessee, and we are inevitably going to be linked to that era and that style of professional wrestling long term. We're always going to hear about the Jerry Lawlers and the Bill Dundees and things of that nature, and it's just one of those things where Memphis was one of the last great territories. It was one of the last ones to filter out after the big expansion from WWF and things like that. And like I've said many times before, I feel like territories could have lasted even longer if they would have been a little smarter about it. But yeah, Memphis wrestling, I'm really excited about today's topic because, me and you both, like I said, because of geographical location, we have a lot of information as far as Memphis goes. So I'm excited to kind of dive in and see what we can talk about today.
All right. Well, from the beginning, one of the things that naturally happens is when we talk about things like Memphis, we naturally talk about things we remember. And what I want to acknowledge off the top is that Memphis wrestling far predates me. Old though I may be to many of the listeners, it does predate me by many, many years. And I think it'd be important for us to acknowledge historically, many people, if you talk about Memphis wrestling, the furthest thing they remember back is, well, something about Jerry Lawler. For obvious reason, he has a long, great career. We all appreciate it. But Memphis wrestling predates Jerry Lawler for the younger members of our audience. And I'd like to, talk a little bit about the history, talk about the events at the Ellis Arena, people like Sputnik Rowe and Billy Wicks, and things that I don't have a personal recollection of, but I don't want to let those things be forgotten and the contributions they made to Memphis wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely. Memphis is a large metropolitan area, so obviously it had many advantages to running wrestling companies. So like you said, the earliest I've seen is like the 30s. That's the earliest that I think I've seen as far as wrestling goes. And there's, like you said, Billy Wicks, but also, Herb Welch. Like we've talked about, we're here at the Herb Welch WrestlePlex right now, and that's because Herb Welch lived in Dyersburg, trained guys here in Dyersburg like Dr. D. David Schultz and Coco Beware and so on and so forth. So he was a huge part of Memphis wrestling too. And also, like a couple years ago on my birthday, my grandmother got me the Luthez record book, and this is something I'd wanted for a while. She found on my Amazon wish list, and I got it for the sole purpose because I wanted to see if Luthez had ever wrestled in Dyersburg, because that was going to make my life. You know what I mean? Turns out he did not ever wrestle in Dyersburg. He did wrestle in Alamo, Tennessee, of all things. It's not that far away.
I count it.
You count it? You're going to count it? I can't count it. Isn't it like Gibson County or something?
Yeah, but look, everything's relative. You mentioning that, this is a personal note from a wrestling fan. Every time I heard Howard Finkel announce that Coco Ware on WWE television mentioned that he was from Union City, Tennessee,
Yeah.
it thrilled me every time I heard it because that was, he was from here.
Yeah, there's been several times I've been watching WrestleMania 3 at the house, and like when Coco's coming out, I'll stop my kids and go listen. And when he goes Union City, Tennessee, they kind of give that double take, like what? Like, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's pretty cool for anything like that. But he was like in a 6-man tag, I believe, in the early 80s. But like what I was saying was about Lou was Lou just did the big towns, right? So he did Chicago, St. Louis, and he did a bunch of Memphis. You know what I mean? So Luthez had a huge history in Memphis that I didn't know about until really I got that book. Because I knew he came through, obviously, but I didn't realize how frequently he actually wrestled in Memphis. So, like, those early days of Memphis we're talking about, one of the greatest world champions of all time, was a huge focal point of it.
All right. Well, kudos to the Golden Granny. First of all, we'll get that out of the way. As always, she's been a tremendous supporter of wrestling in general. We always appreciate her. And one of the other names that's not quite as far back that I think it's appropriate to talk about, because to me he was kind of what led into where I began watching. I did not watch the fabulous Jackie Fargo wrestle a great deal, but I do know he was one of the great draws, I'm going to use the term, in the Memphis wrestling territory that really prior to the Jerry Lawler coming along. And do you have anything you'd like to say about him and his contributions?
Yeah, I mean, Jackie, I think, and here's really where it really comes down to brass tacks is like Jackie Fargo allowed himself to help the business past his career. You understand? Like Jackie Fargo's the one that anointed Lawler the king of Memphis. And I think it was, he was on his way out, and I think he was going to go work somewhere else or something like that. But whatever the reason was, he was the one that got that ball rolling. He's the one that gave him the rub so he could be the king of Memphis, right? So that's huge right there. And then, years later, then all of a sudden he gave the blessing to have the Fabs and have the tag team, and be based off him and his career. And that's something huge. And, of course, they went on to be one of the biggest tag teams in the history of Memphis wrestling, history of territory wrestling, really, when you think about it, because they ended up spanning several territories and being over in every one of them. But that's what I'm saying. Jackie, I'm impressed because I met Jackie Fargo, one time. And he was older then, but he was very respectful to me. I actually got a video of me and Jackie Fargo doing the Fargo strut together.
All right.
So like, how cool is that? Like, here I am, I was born in 1981, but here I am wrestling. I think it was like 2012 or 13, somewhere in there, 2012, I think. And here I am with Jackie Fargo doing the Fargo strut. And he actually told me afterwards, he's like, your Fargo strut's better than mine, kid. You know what I mean? Because, he was older, obviously, and he couldn't get around as well. But, like, he loved that. And we've inducted Jackie into our Hall of Champions here at Pro Wrestling South, had his daughter come and do that. So, I mean, yeah, it's Jackie Fargo to me is what, like, when I talk about Bobby Eaton and I talk about guys that really are more, that love wrestling so much they just want to see it succeed past themselves. You know what I mean? That's the kind of guy I think Jackie Fargo was.
All right. One other thing I think it's worthwhile to mention is people who were in effect the owners or promoters or however you want to refer to it as of Memphis Wrestling. Now, I do not remember, the name I've heard was Nick Goulas. Now, I know he predated. Now, I don't have much recollection of him as just as watching. And leading up through, we go to the Jarretts, and Jerry Jarrett in particular on that promotion. And do you have anything you'd like to add about them? And
yeah, so what had happened with that was Nick Goulas owned pretty much like Tennessee, right? Or he owned Nashville to Memphis, or however the structure worked, right? But Memphis was always looked at as the secondary place. Like, they didn't really put a lot of time and effort in Memphis. They was all geared towards Nashville and Evansville and places like that, right? So when Jerry Jarrett came along, Jerry's mom worked for Goulas, right? Teeny, I believe was her name. And like Jerry ended up getting the business and doing several things, and he asked if he could run the Memphis territory. So then when the Memphis territory started doing pretty well, he asked, well, can I buy the territory? Right? And they're like, okay, you can buy it, right? So they started working out a payment plan kind of thing, I think is what it was, for him to buy the Memphis territory. Well, then they tried to screw him and take it back because it became so successful.
Yeah.
That like he had made it such a success. Well, we can't let this cash cow go. So they tried to screw him out of the thing, and I think that's when he split from them. It was just a big ordeal between everybody. So yeah, it was a huge ordeal between Goulis's and the Jarretts and all that.
So it's fair to say it got somewhat political.
Oh yeah, to call back to our topic of last week,
Yes.
wrestling politics. Yeah, I read Jerry Jarrett's book, and I'd have to brush up on it to give you an exact what all happened. But that's pretty much the gist of it. Like he had built the territory, and they were going to steal it away from him, and he decided, no, we're not doing that. I'm going to go out on my own with no support from the Goulis's whatsoever, and make it work.
All right. Well, I saw mention to bring back a previous subject, and that is something that, hey, when money and things like that, disputes are going to rise. Now I'd like to bring a little bit forward into time frame more of my recollection. It seems like, we cannot talk about Memphis wrestling without talking about Jerry the King Lawler. We mentioned him in relation to Jackie Fargo, kind of, helping elevate him to the top of the card, I think is a fair way to put it. And if you would, just a minute, talk about Jerry Lawler and what he means to Memphis wrestling, which is a big subject, I acknowledge.
Yeah, Jerry Lawler, in my opinion, is one of the greatest professional wrestlers of all time. Obviously, we're sitting here today, and he's in his 70s, and he's still able to go out there and main event, a lot of events. He's been here. He was here just like a year and a half ago, I think. Me and him tagged up. Jerry Lawler obviously is a huge icon when it comes to Memphis and Memphis wrestling, and it's hard to be that guy, to be the number one guy and be the guy that draws the money and has to do all that kind of stuff. But another guy we're going to talk about, I'm sure, but let's go ahead and mention him is Bill Dundee, because it's very hard to be number two, and Bill understood that he was number two in this pecking order. Didn't mean he was less of a worker than Jerry. Didn't mean anything like that. But he was just the number two guy in the territory. And it was always like, if you watch certain time periods of Memphis wrestling, it was a new heel would come in. They would work with Dundee, right? They would beat Dundee, and then they would move up to start working with Lawler. They'd work their program with Lawler. Eventually, Lawler would go over in that. And then they come back down, they'd work with Dundee again. Dundee would beat them on their way out. So everyone won. You know what I mean? Like the heel got over and was able to have a main event program with Lawler, but Dundee got his return on the way out.
Right. Okay, and then Dundee still looks like the credibility with the audience and all that, and I will secretly admit he was always my favorite.
Right.
For what little it's worth. Hey, a lot of us relate to it off things. In my neighborhood, I was 2 years younger than most of the other kids in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And the instant thing, every program involving Dundee usually involved, hey, you're that little whatever.
Yeah.
And everybody talked big until he punched him in the mouth. And
right.
So he naturally was someone I gravitated to.
Yeah, that whole Napoleon complex thing. They say the Napoleon complex is actually not a real term, but we know it exists.
Yes.
I'm not a big stature guy myself, but sometimes I think I'm 10 feet tall and bulletproof because hey, we're not you're not going to disrespect me just because I'm 3 inches shorter than you. You know what I mean, or 6, depending on who I'm fighting. But yeah, like Dundee, and that's what I'm saying. He was just as tough as anyone, and he was a great technical wrestler. And even though Memphis isn't known for technical wrestling, there are some matches, diamonds in the rough, as you'd say, of Dundee versus like Tony Charles and Dundee versus Billy Watts. Or Billy, is that right? Billy Robinson. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Billy Robinson. But there's matches like that where they really showcase how good they were technically. It's where Memphis is more of a blood and guts, punch, kick, get color. The title is kind of a prop kind of thing. Like the title really was never, the Southern Heavyweight title was never like the Mid-Atlantic Championship or the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship. It was never like that kind of thing. It was always like, it would switch every week sometimes. Lawler, I think, is like a 40 or 50 time, Southern Heavyweight Champion. And there's lots of guys that are in 20 time reigns as champion just because, they just flopped it around a bunch. So like that, and with our company, that's kind of what I've always looked at as like we're Memphis, but we still put emphasis on the title.
All right. Well, there's a couple of things that, as you were talking, that kind of sprang to mind. One thing before we get off on the sort of the wrestling aspect, there was one other, let's say, business aspect, and that was the importance and the use of television in the success of the Memphis wrestling territory. Now, this is on my mind for obvious reasons for those of you in this area, but for instance, when I began watching, they were already at WMC TV. Mm-hmm. I did not know anything. I have since heard people mention that they were on WHBQ, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. But to me, TV5 Wrestling, I often refer to it as TV5 Wrestling. Yeah. And always, for many years. Would you kind of talk about the way they use television and its importance to the success of the Memphis territory?
Yeah, one of the huge aspects of it was, Lance Russell and Dave Brown, because, they were newsmen. You know what I mean? They were news and weather, right? And they were, I think Lance was even a station manager or something of that nature, right? And the fact that they were involved, and that's what happened with a lot of territories back in the day, they used those guys as credibility to the wrestling program. And I don't think there's anyone that understood that aspect of the business more than Lance Russell. Lance was very, very good at his job. Like, he's a very underrated ring announcer or a commentator or however you want to put it.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's very, very underrated. Like, a lot of people, when we talk about Jim Ross all the time, we talk about Gordon Soley. Lance Russell needs to be on that Mount Rushmore of what we're talking about. So what they did was they used that television to lend credibility. So when you got a Walter Cronkite type person telling you, hey, this guy is evil, this guy's your good guy, in subtle ways, or being displeased with the way the heels are doing things, like it came across as genuine and it came across as real and people bought it. You know what I mean? And that's what you always want out of your product, is for people to believe what you're doing. So like with Lance, that credibility was what everything was to Memphis, because like they believed, that, Jimmy Hart was this, evil guy that was trying to rid the world of Jerry Lawler in any way he could, in shape and form. And, Lance, oh, Jimmy, please, stuff like that. I mean, like, it was so, you felt it. You felt it through the screen.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, because I have a soft spot in my heart for wrestling announcers, and you just called out my I refer to it as the wrestling announcer trinity, and it's Lance Russell, Gordon Soley, and Jim Ross in no particular order. So thank you for referencing those, because that's something that I've always appreciated. But one of the things that you talked about that I want to get back to is you talked about how Memphis wasn't viewed as a technical wrestling. And that sprang to mind. There's two things that immediately sprang to mind that I thought Memphis, in my opinion, could be given a lot of credit, if you want to call it credit, in kind of directing the way professional wrestling on the larger scale went. The first I like to say, and see how you respond to this, is in some ways I view Memphis wrestling in historical terms as having a bit of a sports entertainment aspect, and I do not mean that as an insult.
Yeah, because so when Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler were partners in owning Memphis Wrestling, that's something that came about. Jerry Jarrett was sole owner at one point, right? And then the story goes that he built this huge house, I guess in Hendersonville or wherever it was, right? And invited all the boys to a housewarming party kind of thing, and they walk in and it's just like a mansion almost. It's this huge house, and like Lawler and Dundee are like, we bought him this house. You know what I mean? They kind of realized how much money was actually on the table through the Memphis territory and stuff like that. So Lawler kind of made a coup where he was going to take over wrestling in Memphis. He was going to jump ship and do his own thing, and Jerry talked to him, and they made a deal. So now they became 50-50 partners, right? So then the deal became Jerry would book for 6 months, and then Lawler would book for 6 months. Now when Jerry booked for 6 months, he usually had a booker. He hired a booker like a Dundee or someone else to do that kind of thing. But then when Jerry booked, it was Jerry booking, right? So when Jerry booked, it was because he's a huge comic book fan. He's a huge, like, that kind of, I don't know, sci-fi, but like, horror movie, that kind of thing. So like, he's the one that brought in, like, the Freddys and the Jasons and the Michael Myers and the Christmas Creature and like Leatherface and like that kind of stuff. So like, yeah, that was kind of the sports entertainment thing of that. But I want to make this clear on some of this stuff too, because like we rag on that Star Ladder. What's her name?
I'm sorry?
The AEW female wrestler. We talk about the alien chick.
Statlander.
Statlander.
Chris Statlander.
Yeah, I can never remember her name. But anyway, we rag on her a bunch because, the whole gimmick is she's really an alien, and that's how announcers were trying to put her over, like she's really an alien, right? Okay, so when Memphis Wrestling did this, they weren't really saying this was Leatherface, or this is really Freddy Krueger, or it was a guy in those masks, you understand? So they never really treated it as if those were the real entities. You understand? So I want people to understand that before people say, well, you rag on, Memphis, you rag on guys that do that kind of stuff all day today, but what about when Memphis Wrestling did it? So I just wanted to clear the air on that. But you understand what I'm saying about the sports entertainment aspect as you're talking about with Lawler and stuff like that, because he was following that kind of guideline.
Yes, I certainly do not mean that as an insult. And I want to tell you, there were a couple of other examples that kind of make me view it that way. As I look back, I remember some of the things I remember fondly are what we would now refer to as vignettes. For instance, when they introduced Kamala, right. I remember that video. They played it for weeks on end leading up. So when Kamala appeared, it was a big deal. And I mean, that video playing over and over again, just Kamala, the Ugandan giant.
Well, even of course, they're credited with the music video.
Thank you.
Because, Rock and Roll Express, the Fabs, Terry Taylor, you know what I mean? Like, everybody at one point, had some kind of music video made of them, and it was just one of those things where we're like, wow, that's kind of interesting. And people, maybe that created the whole rock and wrestling thing in general, because that's where WWF ended up going with Cyndi Lauper and things like that, because Jerry Jarrett was, for some unbeknown reason, him and Vince McMahon got along. Like, of all the territory promoters, that was the one that him and Vince actually got along. So much, in fact, that when Vince was on trial for the steroid thing in the early 90s, if Vince would have went to federal prison, Jerry Jarrett was going to run WWF while Vince was in prison, in his absence. So that's a huge deal, right? So, yeah, same thing. Like, Jerry Jarrett, has, I think that was a lot of his aspect of it too, because he saw MTV and thought, man, how cool would it be if we had this is the Rock and Roll Express. You know what I mean? Why wouldn't they have rock and roll music? You know what I mean? So yeah, that ended up being a huge thing.
Well, and exactly. And as far as the music videos, I'd also throw in the Fabulous Ones.
Yeah.
Everybody Wants You. The Moondogs had their music videos.
Their own music.
Exactly. And as well, here's an honorable mention. For whatever reason, I remember Jeff Jarrett punching his radio clock that was on FM 100, and it began playing New Sensation.
Yeah.
And that was really the build for Jeff Jarrett for the long career he had. That New Sensation video, I can still see it in my head. I was the clock radio, and I see him hit it to start his day. It's kind of a day in the life video.
So to kind of tie everything we've talked about together right quick, since we mentioned Jeff Jarrett. So we were talking about Nick Goulas, right?
Yes.
And last episode we talked about George Goulas. Remember how Nick was pushing his son George Goulas, who wasn't very good, right?
Politics,
exactly. Nepotism. So Jerry Jarrett, when all that was going on, tells Bill Dundee, "If I ever do that, kick me in the ass," is what he said, right? So after Jeff Jarrett had been wrestling a couple of years, or a year or so, I guess. The story goes, Dundee went into Jerry's office and said, "Hey, bend over." And he goes, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I'm going to kick you in the ass." He said, "If you ever did it, kick ass." So Dundee actually says that Jeff Jarrett and that kind of push is what ultimately killed Memphis Wrestling, was because Jeff wasn't a proven draw, but he was pushed to the top of the cards. And then you had guys, and this is another thing, Steve Austin, who went on to be one of the biggest stars in the history of the business. But when he was in Memphis, he was starving. He was making next to nothing. Like the old story goes, he was eating bologna and, raw potatoes, to survive every week. And but Jeff Jarrett was rolling up in, his sports car or whatever it was, and he didn't have to worry about money because he was the boss's kid. But he's the guy on top that's supposed to be drawing the money so everyone else can eat too. And that's where the territory system, like, to me, was always a beautiful thing because, like, if the guy on top is drawing money, then everyone's happy, right? But it was when that guy on top wasn't doing his job or wasn't thing. So it never was like, what's my turn? It's my turn. It's my turn. It's like, well, I'm going to make money. If we're going to make money, I want that guy to be on top. You know what I mean? Like,
certainly.
Yeah.
All right. Another aspect of professional wrestling, which some may view as negative, I don't, although I was never the greatest fan of this. You referred to Memphis as a blood and guts territory. And I think about some of the unique stipulation matches that they had over the years. And, for instance, I remember they had scaffold matches. They had the bull rope matches where they removed the ring ropes, among other things. And then, of course, there's the infamous empty Coliseum match with Lance Russell calling, which holds a soft spot in my heart for that match. Could it be said that in some ways Memphis inspired what we came to be known as hardcore wrestling?
Yeah, I can see that, obviously. I mean, it had a huge impact on that kind of stuff. Like you said, the empty arena match alone, but also concession stand brawl. You know what I mean? The Tupelo concession stand brawl. That was one of those things like, wow. Because it was completely different. It wasn't in a ring. They brawled on the outside. They all ended up in the concession stand. They broke everything they could get their hands on, and just made this huge mess. But, like, it made for great television, right? And here we are. That was in 78, I think, right? So here we are 43 years later. We're still talking about it. So what Memphis did, though, was they sold everything. Like, the hardcore wrestling that we see a lot of times nowadays is they hit each other with stuff, they do a lot of stuff, but then at the end of the day, it's not believable because they're all, they don't sell it like they used to. Like, I'm not a huge fan of death matches at all, because here's the thing. Wrestling's all about selling something, right? Selling your match, right? So a ladder match has a ladder in it, right? A cage match has a cage in it. Death matches don't have death. You know what I mean? So, like, to me, it's automatically going to start from behind the 8 ball. And I don't want to see grotesque violence. I want to see professional wrestling. And if it boils over to the fact of where it gets some intense violence, that's okay, right? But I don't want intense violence just for the sake of intense violence.
I absolutely understand. Well, that would take me off. I could easily get off on a side tangent here, and I don't want to do that. One of the things that I would also like to, this is a very personal observation, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I would like to kind of credit Memphis with a great deal of what I saw in the WWE during the 1980s. And my argument for this would be based on Hulk Hogan spent some time in Memphis prior to his heyday in the WWE. I know he started, I believe, in Minnesota with Vern Gagne. And the way I would argue it is, as I watched Memphis television, a big part of the time I watched it was Jerry Lawler as the top baby face, and there was the top heel manager, Jimmy Hart, who had the first family of professional wrestling. And he would routinely bring in new guys to take out Jerry Lawler. And then, as I watched WWE, I don't know why I can't get that out, or WWF at the time, I would see Hulk Hogan as the top babyface with a notable heel manager, the Bobby the Brain Heenan, one of the all-time greats, as well as really great announcer. And he had the Heenan family. Yeah. And he continuously brought in guys to try to take out Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, and this is one of these things, too, like, like I said before, me and Bobby Eaton tagged for 2 years, right? So I called Bobby one day because I had a question on my mind. I said, hey, Bobby, when somebody, takes someone else's gimmick, how big of a deal was it back in the day? He said, well, it was and it wasn't. Like, you could do it, but as long as everyone agreed where it came from. You understand? Like, you couldn't steal someone's gimmick and then pass it off like you came up with it and you were the first guy to do it. But as long as you recognize that, you weren't the guy that came up with it and you were using it in places they weren't using it to make money, then eventually you guys would maybe be in the same place at the same time. You could draw money against each other, right? So that was kind of the overall consensus of the thing. So same thing with that. Like, I think that obviously there's a huge correlation between that. Like you said, Hogan spent his first little bit in Memphis, and even the famous Hulk Hogan Hulk Up is Lawler dropping the strap. You understand, like the huffing and the puffing and the whole thing. Like it's just because that worked for wrestling, and I think Hogan was smart enough to realize, hey, that worked for him. I think I could do it too. So like I said, as long as everyone's understanding where it came from, then I think most people are okay with it. But yeah, there's a huge correlation, like you said, first family, Heenan family, top baby face, that whole thing. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for that. I certainly wanted to. I wanted to get that in as best I could because that's something that I always wanted to give Memphis the credit for because I saw it even, and you mentioned, in the style of matches and the hulking up and so forth. And I know we're drawing near on time, and I do want to bring it to an end, I didn't even get to mention Andy Kaufman. Oh, goodness. Certainly a high place in the history of Memphis wrestling.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2 someday.
Someday we'll have to find time for that. But I do want to let you wrap it up if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, we love talking about professional wrestling. Today was a fun topic for us because it hit so close to home, figuratively and in actuality. So for myself, the Golden Boy Greg Anthony, and the Mouth of the South, Mark Tipton, thank you for listening to the Midas Touch. Have a good day, and goodbye.